how did you came up with this idea of this interactive idea of handling the story actually?
It actually came out of frustration because I found I was working a lot, let's go back, 10, 12 years ago when I started to help people sort of develop their ideas. And I too would be sitting in a group of people, listening to their ideas and developing them just by talking to them. And I just got really frustrated that I noticed that we were just going round and round and round and all sorts of ideas were coming and we just never felt very consistent. So what I literally found, I would literally choose objects that would be nearby. So maybe somebody's cigarette packet and maybe a glass and maybe a beer mat or something, a bit like when you're in a pub. And I would literally say to someone, hold on, what do you mean here? Because that was when I was developing game shows. And game shows really require you to have something that's a format that's very tight and really makes sense. So I would literally start mapping things out for people and saying, do you mean this is the contestant and this is the goal and this is the thing that they need to get over to get to the goal? And people would be like, yes, yes. And then I started noticing that when you started using objects to do that, then it changed the relationship between me and them and the way that they now wanted to make the thing on the table work rather than simply trying to convince me that they had a great idea. And over time, I just started bringing my own objects to the table because I wanted more objects and I just luckily had lots of Lego and Playmobil around. And then I also noticed that if I got them to choose the objects rather than me choosing the objects, then actually they would then start imbuing each of the objects with meaning and then suddenly what would feel like a very complex or even complicated TV format suddenly became something that we could work on in front of us. So it was born out of frustration, really. I use this in corporate areas where I'm working with people developing policy, best practice, campaigns, marketing, all sorts of things. I think it can work in any area. I think just to take your point between fiction and non-fiction. So when you're working in fiction here, what we are primarily doing is we're mapping the emotional journeys of the characters and we're trying to understand how the different emotional journeys of the characters kind of intersect and interplay with one another. And when we're dealing with non-fiction, documentary, then what we might be doing is we might be trying to map out all the different factors in a world, all the different forces that are at play. A little bit like a stakeholder analysis. If you try to deconstruct a company, a brand, or whatever, you do a stakeholder analysis. You would understand all the different players. And then, so for example, if we were doing a documentary about Bucharest, we would then probably just try to sort of map out, well, what are the key things that we want to sort of capture about Bucharest, and we would kind of create this sort of plan, this map, this overview. And then we would then think about point of view, and we would say, okay, so what stories are emerging from this world, and what is the kind of the perspective we're taking? Not literally what camera perspective are we going to shoot things from, but more like what is the angle that we're going to create? So yeah, it can work with non-fiction, with documentary, and I believe it also works well with fiction.
Why do you think it works so well for people to discover their own stories by means of playing, actually?
Well, it's very interesting that you say this word playing, because playing, I think, what happens when you play, for example, with Lego, it's a very interesting iterative loop between critical and creative thinking. So what's happening is all the time you're being creative, you're building things, and then at the same time you're critically analysing what you're doing. That isn't exactly what we do here, but there's something in that, which is that I think that as soon as you take the idea that's in your head or your heart or your stomach and you get it out onto the table, you create a bit of an overview and you get that slight distance so that you can actually see the thing in its own right, and then you can start interacting with it in its own right. I think the best writers are those who are able to jump between the detail and the overview very, very quickly. And they can understand that if you change this small little bit of detail, it has a large impact on the overview. And if you try to change things in the overview, it's going to affect the way by which you create the detail. And so if you then work in this mapping way, whereby you use objects to map out the story world in which you're working in, and all the different complex needs and wants and incentives and motives of all the different characters in that world, whilst there's going to be a level of complexity there, you're going to be able to handle that complexity, and you're going to be able to jump back and forth, to oscillate between this detail and this overview very, very quickly, and to see the impact that a small change that we'll have on one character here is going to have a large impact on another character there.
In what stage of the producing would you advise someone to use your method?
Well, it's interesting you ask at what stage would I use this. There's a company in Sweden, in Malmö, called Way Creative Films, and they used me 3 times at different times within the production process, within the development process. The first time they brought me in when they'd had maybe a first or second draft of a script. I sat down with writers and directors and producers around a big table, and we mapped out the whole story. And it was on a very broad level, and we'd probably spent about 3 hours doing that. And from that, what that did was it identified a kind of knot within the story. There was a particular problem that was occurring, which we couldn't resolve at that moment between, I think, the daughter, one of the daughters, and the mother, from what I remember. What they then did was they brought me back maybe about 6 months later, or maybe even later, when they'd got some funding in place and they were moving forward with the whole project. And they then gathered producers and directors actually from other production companies, and we sat down, and instead of mapping out the whole story, we just mapped out that part of the story and that part of the relationship that had the problem from before. And we dived into that, and we really worked and worked and worked on that knot, and we resolved it. The third time I came back was might have been about a year or 2 later, where they had all the financing, they had everything in place, and they were just about to make it. But they wanted me to work with the 2 female lead actors who were going to be in the story. So I went up to Stockholm, and we sat down with me, the writer-director, and the 2 actresses, and we mapped out the story so that they could get a sense of their characters' roles within the story in a broader way. So we worked at very, very different stages, and at each stage we worked on very different things. But I think that each stage helped that program, that film. And it's called, oh my word, I've just forgotten the name of the thing. It's it's a Swedish production. It's going to come to me after this, I know. And it's in post-production right now, so it will be coming out in the cinema soon.